The United Nations was established in 1945 with the noble goals of maintaining international peace and security, promoting social progress, fostering international cooperation, and upholding human rights. While the organization has had notable successes, including its role in decolonization, global health initiatives, and humanitarian assistance, it has often fallen short of its original ambitions. Several structural, political, and operational issues have led the UN to deviate from its foundational objectives. Below are the major factors with expanded explanations and examples. One of the most significant structural flaws of the UN is the veto power granted to the 5 permanent members of the Security Council: China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The veto system was intended to ensure consensus among the major powers, but has frequently resulted in deadlocks, preventing the UN from taking decisive action. Example: Syrian civil war. Since the outbreak of the Syrian civil conflict in 2011, the Security Council has been paralyzed by vetoes, particularly from Russia and China. Russia has repeatedly blocked resolutions aimed at sanctioning the Assad regime or authorizing stronger international interventions, citing sovereignty concerns. This paralysis has contributed to the prolongation of the war, resulting in hundreds of thousands of deaths and a massive refugee crisis, bureaucratic inefficiencies and corruption. The UN's large bureaucracy has often been criticized for inefficiency, waste, and corruption, which undermine trust in its operations. Complex procedures and lack of accountability mechanisms exacerbate these issues, such as scandals in Iraq and Sudan. The Oil for Food program, established in 1995, aimed to provide humanitarian aid to Iraqi civilians affected by sanctions. However, it became one of the UN's most infamous scandals, as investigations revealed that billions of dollars were siphoned off through bribes and kickbacks involving companies, governments, and UN officials. This scandal severely damaged the UN's reputation for integrity and accountability. Administrative inefficiencies have plagued UN peacekeeping missions, resulting in delays and inadequate resources. Example: peacekeepers in South Sudan have been criticized for failing to protect civilians despite their mandate. The UN's inability to prevent mass atrocities has been a glaring failure of its peace and security mandate. Despite its role in early warning systems and conflict resolution, the organization has often failed to act swiftly and decisively, as seen in Rwanda and Serbia. Example: Rwandan genocide. In 1994, during the Rwandan genocide, the UN peacekeeping force, known as UNAMIR, was underfunded and constrained by a limited mandate that prohibited proactive measures. Despite warnings from commanders on the ground, the international community failed to act, resulting in the genocide of approximately 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus. Example: Srebrenica massacre. In 1995, during the Bosnian War, the UN declared Srebrenica a safe area. However, when Serbian forces overran the town, UN peacekeepers were unable to prevent the massacre of over 8,000 Bosniak men and boys. This failure underscored the limitations of UN peacekeeping in protecting vulnerable populations. The influence of major powers. The UN's neutrality has been compromised by the influence of major powers, particularly during the Cold War and in subsequent decades. The organization's actions have often been shaped by the geopolitical interests of its most powerful members, as seen during the Cold War and the US invasion of Iraq. Example: Cold War dynamics. During the Cold War, the UN often became a battleground for ideological conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. This rivalry frequently paralyzed the Security Council and limited the UN's ability to address conflict in a balanced manner. Example: invasion of Iraq in 2003. The US decision to invade Iraq without explicit UN Security Council authorization demonstrated the UN's inability to constrain unilateral actions by powerful states. Despite widespread international opposition, the UN could do little to prevent the invasion, which significantly undermined its authority. Challenges in peacekeeping operations, UN peacekeeping missions, while often well-intentioned, have faced significant challenges, including underfunding, limited mandates, and allegations of misconduct by peacekeepers. Example: Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC. The UN mission in the DRC, known as MONUSCO, was established in 1999 and is one of the longest-running peacekeeping operations. Despite substantial financial and personnel investments, the mission has struggled to stabilize the region, where armed groups continue to perpetrate violence. Criticism has been directed at the mission's inability to protect civilians effectively and bring lasting peace. Allegations of abuse, numerous allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse by UN peacekeepers, have tarnished the organization's reputation. Reports from Haiti, the Central African Republic, and other missions reveal a pattern of misconduct, undermining trust in the UN's ability to uphold its own principles. Inequality among member states. The structure of the UN disproportionately empowers a few nations while marginalizing others. This inequity often leads to frustration among smaller or less powerful member states, which feel excluded from meaningful decision-making processes. Many countries in the Global South have called for reforms to make the Security Council more representative. Africa, for instance, lacks permanent representation, despite being a significant focus of UN peacekeeping efforts and development aid. This imbalance fosters resentment and perceptions of bias over time. Numerous countries have shown significant dissatisfaction with the United Nations, frequently criticizing its framework, policies, or decisions, and occasionally suggesting the possibility of withdrawal. However, despite these complaints, no member nation has officially and fully exited the organization, highlighting the intricate challenges and repercussions of such an action. One notable historical instance occurred in 1965 when Indonesia declared its withdrawal in opposition to Malaysia's inclusion as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council. This decision mirrored broader regional tensions, including disagreements over Malaysia's formation and concerns about perceived favoritism within the UN framework. Nonetheless, the UN never formally acknowledged the withdrawal, and Indonesia rejoined the organization in 1966 following a leadership change under Suharto. This event is often viewed as a temporary pause rather than a complete separation, illustrating the subtle dynamics that typically surround such decisions. In more recent times, other nations have similarly voiced frustrations with the UN, though their threats to depart have not resulted in actual actions. In 2016, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte openly threatened to pull his country from the UN after the organization criticized his administration's harsh anti-drug campaign. The campaign, characterized by thousands of extrajudicial killings, received widespread condemnation from human rights organizations and international bodies, including the UN. Duterte accused the UN of overreaching its authority and meddling in domestic matters. Despite his strong language and threats, the Philippines remained a UN member, demonstrating the gap between outspoken dissatisfaction and the logistical, political, and economic hurdles of leaving such a global body. In the United States, debates about exiting the UN have periodically emerged, often fueled by isolationist or unilateralist political groups. The American Sovereignty Restoration Act of 2017, for example, sought to end US membership in the UN, citing concerns that the organization undermined national sovereignty and restricted US policies. While the bill received some backing from fringe groups, it did not gain significant support in Congress. Historically, similar proposals have faced considerable opposition due to fears of diplomatic consequences, the deep integration of the US within the UN system, and the acknowledgement of the UN's essential role in addressing global issues like peacekeeping, humanitarian crises, and climate change. The general agreement within the US foreign policy community remains that engagement with the UN, despite its shortcomings, serves both national and international interests. In this video, we examine the increasing efforts by BRICS nations and countries from the Global South to push for substantial reforms within the United Nations, or, in some instances, to contemplate the possibility of withdrawing from the organization entirely. We analyze the motivations behind this movement, the obstacles these nations encounter, and the potential effects such actions could have on the future of global governance. Countries in the Global South, particularly those in the BRICS group, have intensified their demands for extensive UN restructuring. Collectively, BRICS nations represent over 40% of the world's population and approximately a quarter of global GDP, a share that continues to grow. However, the UN's power distribution, especially in the Security Council, remains based on mid-20th century assumptions. The 5 permanent members holding veto rights, the US, UK, France, Russia, and China, continue to direct much of the Council's agenda, influencing actions on peacekeeping, sanctions, and global security. Despite 54 African countries making up nearly 28% of the UN's membership, none hold a permanent seat on the Council. How did the UN form? The United Nations was established in 1945 following World War II, aiming to succeed.